IMF, when they come in, they come with their own conditions that they give to a country, and those conditions are to help that country to move out of a certain crisis that they are in, and in this case we are talking about the economy.
If we look at the economy now and the stability of the economy, it's the right time to borrow, because you can only borrow when you are doing fine.
Like boma nga yakongola ndrama, so ikakongola ndrama boma wakabatandizira babapasa ndrama pobweza chize ndrama nishi pasarundirako vintu.
But even as the government embarks on this program, the economic recovery program with the IMF, one of the things we expect is fiscal discipline from the government, in that the government should not embark on programs or investing capital investments for which they have no long-term source of financing.
If you look at the statistics, from 1999 to 2014, Zambia's growth was about 7%, which was quite impressive. Sustained growth for over 15 years, 7%. In 2015, that growth rate dropped to 2.9%. 2016 is estimated at around 3.4%. For a small economy that is very dependent on exports, such as Zambia, that growth is not sufficient.
With most of the economic fundamentals going in the wrong direction, our target of growth could not be reached. Indeed, we're only able to get below 3%. Inflation was up. Our reserves were low. So given that particular background and understanding the challenges that we had faced in those 2 years, we as government took a decision that we needed to begin to stabilize the economy as a basis of growth, identifying what is it that was significantly slowing down the economy, particularly in 2015 and 2016.
The challenges we were facing, or we have faced in the last few years, had to do with our international payments, our balance of payments. We were not getting enough earnings from our copper, and therefore not getting enough foreign exchange for us to transact internationally. And therefore the IMF became a natural, of course, core for such a problem. Of course, other partners are also important.
I think our initial concerns around the IMF package were, we weren't sure what exactly were the conditionalities that were going to come with the IMF. And I think now, particularly if you've been following the IMF discussion, I think the IMF of back in the day is very different from the IMF today. And so I think now when we're discussing with the IMF, we come together and decide essentially on what as a country we can do and what we can't do.
If you look at where we are coming from as a country, over a decade, we have been enjoying what one might term as very robust economic growth, like macroeconomic indicators starting from GDP, inflation, and all those that basically considered as prudent for economic management have been on the positive swing until the past 3 years where we actually saw a downswing. But within that period, we also noticed that there has been very minimal reduction in terms of poverty.
So in order for us to start to stabilize the economy, which I'm glad the economy is already stabilizing, but we also have to restore the economy back to the growth path, and therefore Zambia Plus in this case becomes necessary.
Some of the reasons that are driving the stability is one, that we took also the courageous decision to begin to address the arrears to contractors, to providers of services, including payments to the pensioners, so that it creates the liquidity that is necessary to begin to turn the economy going forward. How can we address and enhance domestic resource mobilization, attacking compliance, administration, but bringing in systems and broadening the tax base? Number two, we're also conscious that the reforms are going to impact particularly on the vulnerable people. So how do we deal with the whole issue of social protection? Issues around cash transfers to protect the most vulnerable. Issues around when you change the electricity tariff, how do you make sure that the very vulnerable are also able to access power? We also said one of the things that we must do was regain control of expenditure.
In the last 5 years alone, we've had quite a huge amount of money coming into our economic system. In 2012, the government got a Eurobond of about $750 million US. And then 2 years down the line, 2014, there was another Eurobond of about $1 billion. And then in 2015, there was another Eurobond of 1.2 billion US. All that was money that was coming into our economic system. But then when you look around, when you look at some of the projects that have been implemented, and you look at the impact that these funds have had on our economic system, you discover that there isn't much.
Now the level of borrowing has just gone off the handle in Zambia, to the extent that now our total public debt is about 56% of GDP. So half of your economic activity equivalent is in terms of borrowed money. And you actually see it in terms of the debt servicing. Every year Zambia has to pay back about a quarter of its budget goes back to paying back loans, both domestic and foreign loans and arrears and things like that.
So my recommendation is that our government, as they negotiate this deal, it is a good deal because there are some benefits. One of the benefits that the IMF will bring, I'll talk about the financial discipline. We need to borrow money, thinking that we are going to multiply that money, not just to eat. Because if you borrow for consumption, not for production, it is going to cost our nation.
The deviation from the budget was quite large. So we needed to restore the credibility of the budget, going forward. It was important that we achieve stability. It was important that we begin to grow the jobs. It was important that we use that as a platform to grow the economy in a sustainable manner.
When the 2017 budget was announced, you saw a lot of measures that mean that at the end of the day, we are taking home very little in terms of taxes that have been increased, contributions to so many things that were not there before. This is as a result of government just trying to raise a little bit more revenue to cover up on the deficit that we have.
The truth of the matter is, as long as you have a fiscal deficit, which is at 7% of GDP in 2017, as long as you have a fiscal deficit, what that means is I am going to borrow money to cover the gap between what I need to spend and what I can raise in revenue. The aspect of borrowing is already inherent, is already inbuilt into the national budget. There's no going around it. We need to borrow if we're going to have that 7%. And we can't have anything less than 7% because we know how much finance we can raise domestically.
Zambia does have the capacity to, generate enough resources locally. We frequently talk about the huge potential in several economic sectors to earn us enough revenue, government revenue, to finance our development efforts, the mining sector, the tourism sector, the agricultural sector, and whatnot. But clearly where we are at the moment is that we have failed to generate enough resources domestically to finance our development agenda. For instance, lately we have been running high budget deficits. We have borrowed heavily locally and internationally. We continue to lose millions of kwacha through misappropriation of funds as revealed by the Auditor General's report. We continue to hear of corruption. So if we're able to seal all these loopholes and leakages, it's true that we'll get to a point where we can generate enough resources locally.
Also, if this aid would come through to support our international payments, such as a balance of payment support, it means that the resources would have used to do so can be channeled elsewhere in the economy. We'll create more fiscal space to address other issues, such as infrastructure development and many other issues which this country is currently faced with.
So in order to get the economy fit, IMF becomes part of the process. But our engagement as Zambian with IMF has been on the basis of a homegrown program called Zambia Plus, our own program. And the reason we're bringing in IMF is, one, to support our external sector, the balance of payment support, also to enhance investor confidence.
Zambia is currently eligible to about $1.3 billion. $1.3 billion is bigger than any of the Eurobonds we ever borrowed. But instead of repaying at 9%, at 8% in dollar terms, we would be repaying at no interest rate. So that's useful money that we can have, and that money would release the equivalent of about $600 million every year for the next 2 years. And you program how you use it. You program what sort of employment you are creating. You program how the banks are going to manage the funds and capture transactional charges from it. So all those multiplier effects that help your economy to grow, that help your GDP to grow, they are captured if you have that sort of money. I think like any other economic policy or economic program, there are still a lot of risks that we need to manage. One of the big risks that we need to manage is coming to terms with what our economy looks like. How much debt do we actually have? How costly is this debt? Can we program that properly and put it into our plan so that we are planning carefully together with our partners?
So we took critical reform decisions. And one of the reform decisions that we took was the removal of subsidies on fuel, driving it to market pricing. We also transformed the whole agriculture space, removing the subsidy and the wastage that was inherent in FISIP, and insisting that for 2018, we are going to go e-voucher. The totality of this subsidy impacted on 2016 to the extent of almost $1 billion were out of pocket because of subsidies.
Our concern as civil society is what are the ramifications of the removal of these subsidies, particularly on the low income? How can you ensure that they're cushioned? And so I think you've seen certain things, for example, now with the most recent removal of electricity subsidies, that the government is essentially ensuring that there is essentially a lifeline tariff to ensure that low-income consumers can still benefit from subsidies. And it's different measures like this that essentially encourage us.
If you look at issues to do with pensioners, these also need to receive a lot of attention under this recovery period. First and foremost, if you look at the makeup of our pensioners, most of them actually are those, this is in reference to our national budget, are those in terms of arrears. Most of those that are now retiring are actually not covered under the present budget. And when you're in an austerity period, the possibility of you increasing allocations become very challenging because we are operating under a very tight budget.
And because of the fiscal pressure that was on the budget, we were only anchored by monetary policy. So the anchorage of monetary policy had the consequence of escalating the cost of money. The consequence of monetary policy was to lift up the policy rate and the reserve ratio. And consequently, the liquidity space in the economy was narrowed. So the private sector was not able to borrow. The private sector was not able to function in the correct way. Government in turn suffered because when the private sector is not functional, they are also not able to pay taxes. And when they don't pay us taxes, we are also not able to pay the suppliers of goods and services. So we needed to break that vicious circle.
One of the expectations also, which we expect, is policy consistency with the government. They should be able to provide policies that are consistent and which will be able to allow private sector investment, because the government should not take it upon itself alone to be able to provide jobs for each and every Zambian. They can also bring about policies which are going to encourage the private sector and are going to actually make the private sector to come on board and employ more people, so that the wage bill that the government is facing right now is not so high.
There was another proposal that was made by the government to introduce a 7.5% duty on the importation of copper concentrates. You know, that proposal was made, but then 2 weeks down the line, it was reversed because the mines had complained. I don't think that was a good move.
You look at the issue of value-added tax refunds. It became an issue in 2015 for Zambia, where the mine companies started to claim VAT refunds, and the IMF and the World Bank jumped in, and they said, hey, Zambia, you need to pay back these VAT refunds. Why did they get involved? Why didn't they get involved when Zambia is subsidizing electricity to the tune of about $600 million a year? 50% of that $600 million is a subsidy to the mines because they consume electricity. Why doesn't the IMF ask Zambia, why are you subsidizing the mines? Well, it's because they are protecting the interests of the owners of capital.
So for me, I think the biggest expectation is that this program will help us as a country to be disciplined in the way that we manage our resources, particularly in the way that we spend the little resources that we have.
Our interrogation of the Zambia Plus, but also interactions with the IMF, has indicated that social safeguard has basically pointed towards social protection. And that's a worry. First and foremost, if you look at social protection coverage, despite it receiving a huge jump in terms of 2017 national budget allocation, only covers about 500,000 people. And when you're talking about 40.8%, you're basically talking about 6.1 million Zambian people living in absolute poverty. And if you have 500,000 people that are covered under the social cash transfer, which is about 8%, it's basically a drop in the ocean. But in addition to that, when you put all the social protection interventions, the social protection proper, public welfare assistance scheme, the food security pack, all together, in terms of coverage, you're also looking something about 640,000, somewhere there. Altogether, social cash transfer, all these programs will only account for about 11% of the 40.8% that are affected.
The different social protection measures lie in different ministries. You know, for instance, the famous Farmer Input Support Program is a social protection scheme that's run in the Ministry of Agriculture. And then you have the direct cash transfer, which sits in the Ministry of Community Development and Social Welfare. You have the Youth Empowerment Fund in the Ministry of Youth. So they sit in different ministries or government departments. So the question of coordination obviously comes in. Who coordinates all these social protection measures? The question of ensuring that there is monitoring and evaluation again is not there. But also the more important question of being spread too thinly, also comes into question.
We see within the budget a plethora of different programs, essentially that the government is putting in place to protect the poor. But it's so important, I think, for the government to look at which are the most efficient programs that are, positively affecting the poor. Because with some of these programs, you will find that there's a large number of people who are getting such a small amount of money. So in terms of the actual impact that it has on their day-to-day lives, it's marginal. And so essentially, I think what's important is to look at the programs that are currently in place and look at the ones that have the most meaningful positive impact and continue with those.
You need to start looking at programs that are going to ensure that at least bring into aspects wealth redistribution through aspects to do with economic empowerment. You're looking at aspects that are going to look at gender and income inequalities. How do you ensure that you tackle those? And these have to be deliberate, creating very strong linkages to the economic programs that are going to be put in place to those of poverty reduction.
We do need a recovery program that reminds ourselves how we're going to plan in the medium term and how we're going to stick to our plan, how we're going to execute and rein in fiscal discipline. If we can't do that, then the whole story of growth and recovery becomes a myth.
The program with IMF is under our control. We have shifted from the preconditionality era of saying you must, to benchmarking. And all we are saying in that program is, for example, that you are going to maintain your fiscal deficit not more than 7.4% of GDP for 2017. Is the answer yes or no? We said yes, and that was our number. You are going to ensure that your debt levels are kept within sustainable parameters. And we say yes. So those are decisions that are taken by ourselves.
If you have a relationship with an external party, a party that can be impartial, that can be objective, then you are more accountable and transparent to that party. Then it helps you to maintain your fiscal discipline. The IMF comes as an automatic check and balance for the government. So they'll help you to do things like debt sustainability analysis, to check into your own books and say, are we on track? Are we actually keeping to the commitments that we made?
The short-term impacts of many of these subsidy reforms are going to be painful. But unfortunately, it's a process that we need to go through. I think as civil society, one of our thoughts is that, at the end of the day, if we say we need to go through difficult times, everybody equally needs to go through that. And we're talking about, those right at the top of society in terms of the higher echelons, For example, they, number one, should be carrying the brunt of this burden to ensure that it's not only the poor and the low income that are being penalized.
And that is important, and that's where citizens now need to come in, civil society needs to come in, to ensure that the realignment of government priorities is actually done well with the interest of the poor in mind.
So our expectation is that once the agreement is reached between the Zambian government and the International Monetary Fund, whatever financial resources will be dispersed would, in the final analysis, benefit the majority of Zambians who are classified as poor, will lead to job creations, for example, will lead towards improving productivity in the agricultural sector, because, as you know, the majority of Zambians depend on land to eke out a living.
The government has already embarked on implementing Zambia Plus, and this has to continue. So what has been spelled out in Zambia Plus, if implemented to the letter, success is guaranteed.
We have seen significant investments that are coming, particularly in energy, in agriculture. Those are critically important to create the jobs and to begin to support the stability as a basis of growth.
If you buy into the IMF and the IMF buys into your program, your national programs, then it says to the international community, the IMF is confident in Zambia. And once that signal is sent, you will see investors coming to Zambia, knowing that it's a stable environment. You will see other countries being more willing to serve as donors to support your programs from a poverty perspective, from a growth perspective.
The economic recovery plan has been set for under the MTEF period, so 3-year period. But that is also been embedded within the 7th National Development Plan. And there are key indicators. So our emphasis is for citizens to take keen interest on issues of national development.